1489. The Black Plague ravaged the continent. It was the hour of the infamous auto de fe, where for public amusement, heretics and non-believers were tortured and burned in a carnival-like atmosphere, and it was guided by the most fearful spectre to ever sit in judgment over good and evil, the Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada.
All pay heed! Now enters His Holiness, Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. Torquemada, do not implore him for compassion. Torquemada, do not beg him for forgiveness. Torquemada, do not ask him for mercy. Let's face it, you can't Torquemada anything.
Let all those who wish to confess their evil ways and to accept and embrace the true church convert now or forever burn in hell. For now begins the Inquisition. The Inquisition. Let's begin the Inquisition. Look out, see, we have a mission.
So today, the Inquisition hits the road and gets to North America and South America. We're going to talk about the Christianization of Latin America. Remember that one of the reasons that Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to the whole crazy Columbus idea in the first place is because there was potentially a large population of people to convert to Catholic Christianity. They just didn't anticipate that they would be found in two continents. Basically, on every European ship that arrived in North and South America, at least in Spain or Portugal's empire, you were going to find some Catholic priests. Most of them are Jesuits, but you do see some Franciscans and Dominican monks. And let's also remember where the Jesuits come from. The Jesuits are sort of an answer to the Protestant Reformation. They are part of the Society of Jesus, and the goal is to expand Christianity into the New World to sort of make up for the loss of Protestant believers. And spoiler, they more or less accomplished that mission. Now, for the most part, the Spanish conquistadors weren't incredibly interested in the ordinary lives of the natives that they conquered. They were really only interested in what the natives could do for them and didn't really observe their ordinary lives, whereas many of these Christian monks actually did, and in fact, that was kind of a requirement if they were going to recruit them to, evangelize to them and eventually convert them to Christianity. So oftentimes these monks, these clerics, we can just kind of simplify and say clerics, live out in the countryside and rural areas where the indigenous people actually lived, not necessarily in like fortified compounds where, for example, conquistadors or colonists actually lived. So they carry out a variety of different functions. In some respects, they carry out a lot of the same functions that the Catholic Church did during the Middle Ages. If you remember, we said the Catholic Church, for a lot of ordinary people, was the only form of government they actually saw on an individual basis. So they're establishing churches, and among other things, they're introducing things like the printing press, religious texts like, take a guess, the Bible, but also philosophy, poetry, law. Basically, if you're looking at what brings European culture to the Americas, it's not the conquistadors. They bring European conquest, but the people who actually bring European culture are these guys. In theory, they're supposed to care for the poor. And again, they also provide a huge impact on the cultural and intellectual life in the colonies. Now, the Catholic Church isn't exactly an organization of tree-hugging pacifist hippies, but the fact is that it's a religion that is founded on the teachings of a Jewish man who said, if somebody hits you, turn the other cheek. So when many of these Catholic clerics witness the violence in the New World, that provides a lot of controversy and debate over the very nature of Spanish rule. For example, you have this charming passage left by Father Bartolome de las Casas, who writes a short account of the destruction of the Indies. Basically, the title kind of gives it away. I'm not going to read the text right here because my son is in the next room and I don't want to give him nightmares, but yeah, you get a sense of what the conquistadors were like and the extent that they would go to in order to get what they wanted. By the way, if this is actually not even the worst part, if you would like, and you have a pretty strong stomach and constitution, in the notes of the Google Slides, you can actually see a longer version of the same excerpt, which gives you even gorier and more horrific details of the Spanish conquest. But if that's not your jam, and I hope to a certain extent it's not, just take it that the conquistadors were, even in a violent age, they were especially violent. Within the Catholic Church, there was a pretty stark division between those who believed that it was immoral to control the Native Americans, others who believed that the Native Americans needed to be controlled to be introduced to Christianity and to be civilized, and this was just basically the price that was to be paid for doing so. Then you also had those Europeans in the Catholic Church and also outside the Catholic Church who basically believed that Native Americans had no culture, that they were basically to be treated as animals and sometimes just killed out of hand. Now, arguably, one reason for the absolutely horrific amount of violence perpetrated on the Native Americans is look at this population imbalance between Europeans and non-Europeans. So essentially, the Spanish have no chance if there's a universal or general Native American uprising against them. The population is just too stacked against them. And by the way, it more or less remains that way all the way to the 19th century. So despite the huge population loss, Native Americans are still in the majority of the overall population, more or less. But if we're looking at what they suffered, we've already gone over this to a certain extent, but yeah, severe decline in population. Gee, you think? Basically, I've used this statistic before, but roughly 90% of the Native American population, is lost within 100 years after the Columbian Exchange. They suffer slavery, especially in, for example, these big plantations called haciendas that we'll talk about a little bit later. They also experience slavery. So the big killer is still diseases like smallpox, measles, bubonic plague. You also have a complete disruption of social and economic structures, and also just in many cases, the elimination of just entire societies. And when you have that level of destruction, it also contributes to a loss of cultural practice and languages, especially in those tribes that only have oral traditions, like the Mayans, the Aztecs, they at least have a pictographic system of writing using hieroglyphics. If you remember the Inca, for example, they don't really have a traditional writing system in a way that we would understand it. And then you have tribes that don't even have the system of tied knots like the Incas do. So in other words, when that generation dies off, that just means the civilization dies off. Also, the environment of the New World was completely transformed by the Europeans, especially by bringing in livestock. So we're talking about cows, horses, sheep, etc. Remember, none of those animals are really native to the New World. The only domesticated livestock is the almighty alpaca, llama, and of course, first period, ulama. So in about 60 years, basically the Native American population gets surpassed by the population of livestock. And it's important to know that these animals have no natural predators, really. So these animals destroyed lots of the natural vegetation in these areas, and also transformed the diets and the material culture of the people in North America by supplying wool, hides, milk, and meat.
Yee. pew, 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 pew. Ah. Ow.
So the Columbian Exchange leads to the collision of three worlds. There's the Native Americans, there's the Europeans, and then there are West Africans. So when you throw all of those groups into the mix, they start intermarrying, and in many cases, especially if you're looking at the Europeans, there's a lot of sexual exploitation that occurs. So the Europeans are coming in as conquerors, migrants, and colonists. The Native Americans are conquered. They're generally what we call the indigenous people. And then Black Africans are almost entirely slaves. So when these population groups begin intermixing, this kind of creates this very new, very complicated, and very significant class system. So eventually, power in these colonies is held by a group called the Peninsulares. These are individuals who are born on the Iberian Peninsula. In other words, this is a way of saying that they're European. Then the second group is the Criollos. These are colonists that are born in the New World, but they have European parentage. And oftentimes, these are the people sort of in the middle management positions. These are your bureaucrats, these are your officers. But as you can kind of imagine, there's going to be a significant amount of resentment from this group to this group, because essentially, it doesn't really matter how much you know about the New World. These people, many of whom have never set foot in the New World until like recently, always get to boss you around. Okay, so now you have a group called the Mestizos. These are basically Europeans plus indigenous people. This group comprises the vast majority of the population of Latin America today, by the way. Then you also have groups called the mulattoes. These are basically individuals of mixed European and African ancestry. And then you have the Zambos. These are groups of Native Americans and Black Africans who have basically produced children with one another. Here is that ethnic/racial hierarchy expressed graphically, but it's also not just about race. It's also about where you're born, at least if you're looking at, for example, the Europeans. So by 1650, 10% of the population was considered Criollos throughout Latin America. By 1750, that number has grown to about 40%. And the job that you got in the New World very much depended upon which of these groups you were in. So, for example, if you were part of the Peninsulare class, well, that probably meant that you were like the Viceroy of New Spain, or you're like one of the king's direct appointees to the New World. If you're part of the Criollos class, that probably means you are army officers, you are bureaucrats. If you're talking about like the mestizos, for example, you're going to be your laborers. Oftentimes they're going to be some of your soldiers, that kind of thing. So now let's look at relations in North America. Basically, we mean what will eventually become the continental United States and Canada. So we're sort of like removing Mexico from the analysis, since that's obviously sort of a hub of Spain's new empire. So we're talking about the English and the French empires for the most part. Now, in that area of the world, there aren't really any major or large empires. You have tribal confederations, like, for example, Pocahontas' daddy, Powhatan. He controlled a very large tribal confederation consisting of about 20,000 Native Americans, but that was considered really large in what will eventually become the United States. I'm just going to call it colonial America, by the way. In colonial America, a tribal confederation of about 20,000 people was really large, whereas in Mexico, where you have large empires, or had large empires like the Aztecs, 20,000 was like a drop in the bucket, man. It just wasn't that big. So in colonial America, you're dealing with just a different order of magnitude, a smaller order of magnitude, actually. Also remember that in colonial America, most of the colonists were just that. They were colonists. You don't really have a lot of soldiers or adventurers. You have, for the most part, especially in the northern colonies, you have a bunch of nuclear families coming there to live, not just people who go there to work temporarily. So you don't have as much intermarriage that's going on. You do eventually have some when settlers, especially a group called the Scots-Irish, when they start pushing into the western frontier. And you do have a substantial amount of intermarriage that happens between France's colonists and the Native Americans. But if you're looking at the large colonies along the eastern seaboard of colonial America, there's not a lot of intermarriage that's going on. Now, slavery existed pretty much universally throughout colonial America, but as we're going to see, in the northern colonies, slavery existed more in theory than in practice. So, for example, by the eve of the American Revolution, something like only 2 to 5% of the population of Massachusetts was enslaved. Contrast that with the population of South Carolina, where throughout most of the 18th century, 60% of the population of South Carolina was considered enslaved. There is a very strict racial hierarchy that develops throughout the southern colony. So we're talking about South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, so on. And basically the hierarchy is you're either black or you're not. After that, the hierarchy really revolves more around how much land someone owns rather than whether they were from Europe. So if you look at the white European population, the especially powerful individuals are those who own most of the land, at least in the southern colonies. But you don't have mulattoes in the American South the same way you do in Latin America. If someone was born with any African ancestry, they were just considered black. So oftentimes, and this is a very uncomfortable and gross topic to talk about, so I'm expecting you to do so or listen to this with some maturity. So slave masters would frequently sexually assault their slaves. And oftentimes, as a product of that sexual assault, you would have children being born. So not only is the sexual assault absolutely repulsive, but then you also have this repulsive dynamic that slave owners could have children and basically consider their own children slaves. That was very common throughout the American South. And actually, it's to a certain extent, some of those relationships, the more and more they become public, that leads to this push for abolitionism in the 1800s. But that's looking a little too far forward. Okay, so that is the result of Christianization in Latin America and basically the different social structures that take form. Next time, we're going to look at the economy of North and South America. Till then.